Hello and welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. Welcome to the virtual reading group. Today we're going to be talking about Hannah Arendt's essay, What is Authority?, which is chapter 3 of her book, Between Past and Future. It's a very difficult essay, and a lot of it in the middle goes into a history of philosophy with Plato and Aristotle and Hobbes and Luther and others. And so we're going to try and work our way through it in a short introduction. We can't cover everything, but I do hope this will make your path of reading it a little bit more pleasant and enlightening. So the essay begins with a preface or a prologue. There's 6 parts to the essay, and this is part 1. And it starts with a very simple rhetorical move, which is to say, the essay is called What is Authority? The next one will be called What is Freedom? And she begins by saying, well, actually, it should be called What was Authority, because authority no longer exists. And so this requires somewhat of a definition of authority. And Arendt gives us one on page 91. She says, authority is the authentic and undisputable experience that is common to all. And on page 105, she'll offer another definition. Authority implies an obedience in which men retain their freedom. So, authority is an obedience, obeying, in which you're still free. That means you're not obeying because you've been persuaded to do so, or you are violently forced to do so or compelled to do so. It's a kind of obedience that comes from a free desire to do so, a free acceptance that the authority is valid, undisputable, and common to all, and you don't need to be persuaded into it. And this sort of non-rational, non-logical authority, she says, has largely been lost in the modern era, both in its political and its pre-political forms. So even the more pre-political and maybe more obvious realms of authority, so for example, parental authority, which, you know, if your kid says to you, why, you don't sit there and try and give a logical explanation, or if you do, that's often called bad parenting. There's supposed to be authority. There's supposed to be a parent in charge, and this authority, Arendt thinks, is lost, and it's lost in education. It's the same reason why teachers and professors have to constantly establish their authority, and it's lost in religion, and it's lost also in politics. There aren't simply authorities that we obey. The old Kantian saying that we now, enlightenment means that we are responsible for ourselves, that we can question everything, and we need explanations for why we should obey. And so there's this basic premise of the essay, that there's this loss of authority, and she ties the loss of authority to 3 losses. She calls it the loss of tradition, the loss of religion, and then the consequent loss of authority. The loss of tradition she talks about on pages 94 and 95, and she says that we are in danger of forgetting, and such an oblivion would mean that, humanly speaking, we would deprive ourselves of one dimension, the dimension of depth in human existence. And so there's a consequence to the loss of tradition, and there's also a consequence to the loss of authority. So on page 95, she writes, authority, resting on a foundation in the past as its unshaken cornerstone, gave the world permanence and durability, which human beings need precisely because they are mortals, the most unstable and futile beings we know of. Its loss is tantamount to the loss of the groundwork of the world. So on the one hand, the loss of tradition is the loss of depth. The loss of religion, she'll say, is the loss of faith. And the loss of authority is the loss of the groundwork for the world that we mortals, who are unstable and futile, need. We need a world that's permanent and stable. And without authority, we constantly have to re-justify the world We have to rationalize the world, and the permanence and durability and stability of the world are thrown into question. And this is the question then that she's asking in this essay. The question, I think, is, given that authority is necessary and yet authority has been lost, the question is how to live in a world without political authority. And she's going to say that there's some good things that come with the loss of authority: more freedom, more ability to remake the world anew, more spontaneity. And so her answer to this question of how to live in a world without authority, she gives really on page 95, where she writes, quote, "The loss of worldly permanence and reliability, which politically is identical with the loss of authority, does not entail, at least not necessarily, the loss of the human capacity for building and preserving and caring for a world that can survive us and remain a place fit to live in for those who come after us." So even though authority is, in some sense, necessary for stability and permanence and durability, the loss of this worldly permanence and durability, the loss of authority, is not necessarily a loss of the human capacity to build and preserve and care for a world that can survive us. It's still possible that we can build a world that lasts and has some durability, even without authority. And that is very much the thesis and the inquiry of this essay, is to begin thinking about the problem, the need to build a world that's permanent and durable and stable and lasting without authority, and to begin thinking about how to do so. Still in this first prologue section, section 1, she has two other points that are confusing and yet quite interesting and important. The first is that she says we need to be able to make distinctions to talk about authority. And here she's trying to, she's drawing on a lot of her earlier work, but on the difference between totalitarianism, tyranny, authoritarianism, and other forms of government. And she says on page 95, we can't just give these words any old meaning and let them all mean the same thing. They mean different things, and we have to make an effort to try and distinguish what they mean. So she'll write, when we define our own terms then, tyranny, authority, and totalitarianism have simply lost their common meaning, or we have ceased to live in a common world where the words we have in common possess an unquestionable meaningfulness, so that, short of being condemned to live verbally in an altogether meaningless world, we grant each other the right to retreat into our own worlds of meaning. So this is a common point of Arendt's, which is that, well, she's not an analytic philosopher, and she's not going to sit there and, pick over the words and try and make these logic games out of it. She does think that to live in a political world means to talk a common language, and we have to agree on what these words mean. And otherwise, we live in a meaningless world. We grant each other the right to retreat into our own worlds of meaning, and we live in this completely solipsistic world. And so she says that with the connection to the word authority, which is the topic of the essay, there are two theories which have made this word incredibly confusing. The first is the theory of liberalism. The liberalism, which she takes to generally mean the idea of a constant historical progress towards freedom, in the old sense of liberalism, that government is increasing liberty and freedom in the world. And she says that this ignores important distinctions, that there are, in authoritarian regimes, she thinks, there's a restriction on freedom. But in tyrannies, there's more than just a restriction on freedom. There's the abolition of public freedom. You can still be free in private, but you really can't be free to oppose the tyrant. Whereas in an authoritarian regime, you can, she thinks. And then in totalitarian regimes, there's the total elimination of freedom. And she says these are three different kinds of regime. And liberalism, which sort of sees the progress towards freedom, sees all these kinds of regimes, authoritarian regimes, tyranny, and totalitarianism, as simply the same. They're regressions on the progress towards freedom. And she says that's a confusion that needs to be dealt with. She then makes a very interesting distinction between liberals and conservatives, whereas liberals see all deviations from the constancy of progress towards freedom as reactionary, and thus they see all power as illegitimate insofar as it restricts freedom. Conservatives, she thinks, also deny this distinction, but in the opposite direction. They see the dwindling of authority instead of the growth of freedom to be such that freedom becomes helpless and defenseless in the face of anarchy, because without authority there is just anarchy, and thus there's a kind of totalitarianism in the democracy and the anarchy of wants. So both liberals and conservatives don't make enough distinctions and end up imagining that all sorts of authoritarian regimes for liberals are bad and all sorts of libertine regimes for conservatives are bad. The second theory that she speaks about is the rise of the social sciences and the functionalization of concepts, such that communism is one example of this she likes to use a lot, which is atheistic and yet is a kind of new religion, people say, but that's because it functions like a religion, and yet you can't call it a religion. It's atheistic, and you have to understand it on its own terms. And that's a distinction. To say that communism is a kind of religion, she thinks, is to ignore important distinctions. Similarly, when you think that violence fulfills the same function of authority, namely that it makes people obey, and we say that a violent regime is an authoritarian regime, for her that's absolutely wrong. Violence emerges when there is no authority, right? Authority is, as she said earlier, when you obey something without having to be convinced or forced to do so. Okay. The last thing that happens in this part one, this very densely packed opening pages of this essay, is that she talks about three models of authority. So there's authoritarian models, there's tyrannical models, and there's totalitarian models. Authoritarian models, she talks about Christian, Roman, and Roman models, and there's this pyramid. So there's this pyramid, the Christian pyramid with the tip on the top, and authority is filtered down from God to the popes, to the priests, etc., down to the bottom, and authority comes down. The Roman authority is, she calls it the inverted pyramid. Authority begins with the ancestors and then works its way up through the senators and then the nobles and then eventually to the plebeians and the people. And so this is a kind of authoritarian regime. A tyrannical regime for her is a pyramid, but only with the top and the bottom. It's like tyrant and the people, and there's no intermediate levels, no intervening layers. Finally, the third model of authority is the totalitarian model, like an onion, and there's the center of the onion with the totalitarian leader, and he faces out, but at every other level, the levels face in towards the leader and outwards, and they face in two directions. And the idea here is that you, on the one hand, normalize totalitarian leadership to the outside world, but you also sort of rationalize it and prevent it against the shock of the outside world by facing it inwards to the leader. There are, she then says at the end of this first section, 4 questions, and they relate to the next series of chapters. So the first questions are, what were the political experiences that corresponded to the concept of authority and from which it sprang? Where does authority come from? And she develops this in relation to the Romans and the Greeks. The Romans, for her, are the first people to really have a concept of authority, but they only develop it in response to the thinking of the Greeks. So there's a Roman submission to what she calls the Greek idea of truth from Plato and Aristotle that they develop into a kind of authority which the Greeks never had. And that is parts 2 and 3 of the essay. Part 2 dealing with Plato, and part 3 dealing with Aristotle, both for the Greeks. Then part 4 asks the question, what is the nature of a public political world constituted by authority? And here the exploration is Rome, and how in Rome this idea of a foundation and a traditional historical foundation provides authority that constitutes a political world. And then she asks, is it true that the Platonic Aristotelian statement that every well-ordered community is constituted of those who rule and those who are ruled, and that this was valid prior to the modern age? Or, if you want to put it differently, what kind of world came to an end after the modern age, not only challenged one or another form of authority in different spheres of life, but caused the whole concept of authority to lose its validity altogether? And here she's going to speak about the rise of the modern world in Luther and Hobbes in part 5 of the essay. Part 6 will then turn to the one attempt to reconstitute authority in the modern world through the idea of a new foundation in a revolution. So I'm going to go quickly through these first few sections of this essay because they're dense, and I hope you make your way through them, but they're very much readings of Plato and Aristotle, and can't do everything in this short introduction. So in part 2, the argument here is that the Roman origin of authority comes from the Greeks, but the Greeks did not themselves have an idea of authority, and the closest they came was Plato's Republic. And the point of that is that in Plato's Republic, Plato replaces persuasion, which had been the Greek way of doing politics, with the idea of philosophical truth. So because Plato now was no longer trusting the people to come up with, to through persuasion and argument, make the right decision. This is in the wake of the murder of Socrates. We need to establish truths that will govern the Republic. And for him, the trouble with coercion and reason, he says, and Arendt quotes this on page 107, is that only the few are subject to it. And Plato says that's not good enough. We need to make all people subject to authority. And he turns to myths in the Republic, the myth of error and others, and also of laws in the laws. And his point is to create a philosopher king who will rule according to truth, because we no longer trust persuasion. But truth itself is not a concept that necessarily has authority. And that brings us to Aristotle. Like Plato, his question is how to conceive authority without coercion or persuasion. And Aristotle answers, well, that's great that the philosophers know truth, but if they have to force it upon people or create myths, that's not authority, that's deception. And so he says education is the answer. And on page 118 Arendt writes, the substitution of education for rule had the most far-reaching consequences. And so here the argument is that education will take over for authority in politics. On page 119, she writes, quote, political authority can acquire an educational character only if we presume with the Romans that under all circumstances ancestors represent the example of greatness for each successive generation, that they are the mayores, the greater ones, by definition. The danger for Arendt in confusing political authority and education is that we begin the process of brainwashing. She'll say later in this book, in the essay on the crisis in education, that all attempts to speak about education in politics smack of tyranny and brainwashing. And so the only way it works is if we accept the fact that our ancestors, the mayores, the great ones, had it right. And so the only way education as a path to truth can yield authority is when education is bound with a strong sense of tradition, the sacredness of a foundation. And that's the Roman model of authority that Arendt now talks about in section 4. In 4, she's answering the question is, what is the nature of the public political world constituted by authority? And her answer is, it's in Rome, and it's based on a foundation in which the traditional authority of the ancestors is taken for granted. They are given authority, and authority comes from an understanding of the truth and value of our world rooted in the world of our ancestors. So she'll write on 120, at the heart of Roman politics, from the beginning of the Republic until virtually the end of the imperial era, stands the conviction of the sacredness of foundation, in the sense that once something has been founded, it remains binding for all future generations. This is really her idea of authority. It's a bindingness back to the beginning, to the foundation. Religion is a religare, right? A being tied back to the past. She quotes Livy on 121, who writes, "While I write down these ancient events, I do not know through what connection my mind grows old and some religio holds me." It's this Roman idea that as we learn about our past, we are bonded, retied to, back to the foundation. And it's these, and this foundation has no power. It's not violent. It's not persuasive. It's dead. And yet, this idea that the most conspicuous characteristic of those in authority is that they do not have power, which she writes on 122, is very much the source of her idea of authority, which connects it to legal authority and constitutionalism, which she will do a little bit in this book, but primarily in her book on revolution when speaking about the American Supreme Court. In Rome, the source of authority was the Senate, and the idea is that the senators were nobles and reincarnations of the Roman founders, and thus could reinterpret the Roman Constitution not in the present, but as the founders would in the present. And she understands that to be also the model of authority in the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Supreme Court. The chapter 5 begins the crisis of authority, the loss, the break of tradition, which we talked about in chapter 2 of this book, the loss of the concept of history, and also in chapter 1, the tradition in the modern age, in which she talks about the break of tradition. And that's very much what all this book is about, is how to do politics after this break of tradition. And here the question is, how do we do politics once this foundation, once authority is no longer really available? And she talks about the myth of hell, and how the fear of hell has been used by all civilizations and all great thinkers, from Plato to the Christians to the moderns, to keep men in line. On the one hand, it strengthens authority, but on the other hand, it can weaken authority insofar as it brings a kind of deception and violence into that nature of authority, and can weaken the faith that is the true source of authority. We can't return to authority, and we can't return to bring hell back, she says. The fear of hell, she writes on page 135, is no longer among the motives which prevent or stimulate actions of a majority. And so not only is authority dead, but the thing that would strengthen authority and give it an added boost, hell, that also, and religion, that also is no longer available. And so, for Arendt, that is the depth of our problem. Finally, the last section, section 6, is to ask, is there a way to reimagine a kind of political authority after the loss of authority and the loss of religion and the loss of tradition in the modern world? And she says, no, with one exception, the experience of revolution. And the one revolution that she thinks provides evidence for the possible success of creating authority out of the experience of revolution is the American Revolution, the U.S. Revolution. She says that all revolutions since the French Revolution have failed to refound authority, on page 141. And part of her overarching research and thought about revolutions is that revolutions have largely taken their guide from the French Revolution and not the American Revolution. And she thinks that's a mistake. And so on 141, she writes, quote, "For to live in a political realm with neither authority nor the concomitant awareness of that the source of authority transcends power, and those who are in power, means to be confronted anew without the religious trust in sacred beginning and without the protection of traditional and therefore self-evident standards of behavior by the elementary problems of human living together." So is there a way, she's asking, to in some way reimagine authority? And she says there's only one successful attempt, as I said, the American Revolution. So on 140, she'll write, "Of these attempts, only one, the American Revolution, has been successful. The Founding Fathers, as, characteristically enough, we still call them, founded a completely new body politic without violence and with the help of a constitution. And this body politic has at least endured to the present day, in spite of the fact that the specifically modern character of the modern world has nowhere else produced such extreme expressions in all non-political spheres of life as it has in the United States." She doesn't go further into this in this essay, but for those of you who have read her book on revolution, that's what the book is really about. And what I can say for now is that she talks about how there were two great achievements of the American Revolution. One was a new concept of power, a power without sovereignty. So her idea that the American Revolution and Constitution created multiple sources of power. There was the federal government, and then there were the three branches of the federal government, the legislative, executive, and judiciary. But there was also state governments and different branches there, and then local governments, but also NGOs, and really a voluntary world spirit in the United States. She's very indebted to Tocqueville here in his description of American democracy. And what she argues is that this was a conception of power which did not lead to a kind of sovereignty that could lead to tyranny. And at the same point, power itself would not be enough to create a new and lasting political world. What was needed was authority. And she argues that the Supreme Court, which she thinks much like the Roman Senate, and she thinks the founders explicitly modeled the Supreme Court on the Roman Senate as the place in which the founder's voice would be carried forward into the future and personified in the justices. And she says that the moment that the American Supreme Court and the American Constitution came to be worshipped was the moment that a new concept of authority was born in the United States. The book doesn't end so happily. She thinks that concept of authority has largely been eroded in the 20th century, but not fully. And it's that idea of authority that she thinks is potentially something that can be refounded in the modern world, not on the basis of an old tradition, not on the basis of an old authority, but through the experience of a revolution, in which, in that experience, people become caught up in the new, but also the desire to stabilize and hold on to this experience of freedom which one finds in a revolution. And they embrace and develop a new authority like the Constitution and the Supreme Court. So that's the effort. That's the hope. She ends with always hope that's tough to come by. So on page 141, the last few lines, she writes, quote, "For to live in a political realm with neither authority nor the concomitant awareness that the source of authority transcends power, and those who are in power, means to be confronted anew without the religious trust in a sacred beginning, and without the protection of traditional and therefore self-evident standards of behavior by the elementary problems of human living together." And that's the challenge we have without a revolution that founds freedom anew, to confront the loss of authority, confront it anew without any religious or sacred or traditional authorities, and once again commit ourselves to the elementary problems of human living together. I hope you enjoy reading this essay. It's very hard. I hope this helps you get through it, and I look forward to discussing it with you. Thank you very much, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt.